The morning light of June 6, 1944, broke across the English Channel with an unnatural quality. Something was wrong with the horizon. Oberst Fritz Zeigler, a staff officer attached to Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt's headquarters, raised his field glasses and felt his breath catch in his throat. The sea had disappeared. In its place stretched an endless carpet of steel and grey paint. Ships, thousands upon thousands of ships, destroyers cutting through the swells, battleships with gun turrets the size of houses, transport vessels disgorging smaller craft like mechanical insects, landing ships of types. German naval intelligence had never catalogued. Zeigler tried to count them. 10, 20, 50. He lost count somewhere past 100 and gave up entirely when he realized that what he had been counting was merely one small sector of a fleet that stretched beyond the limits of his vision in both directions. Behind him, a young lieutenant whispered a single word that would echo through Wehrmacht command posts across France that day. Unmöglich. Impossible. But it was not impossible. It was real, and it represented the culmination of a catastrophic German miscalculation that had begun 3 years earlier, when Adolf Hitler declared war on the United States. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The miscalculation had not been tactical or even strategic in the traditional military sense. It had been ideological. On the night of January 8th to 9th, 1942, just 1 month after declaring war on America, Hitler sat in his headquarters and delivered one of his evening monologues. His words, recorded by Heinrich Heim and Martin Bormann for what would become known as Hitler's Table Talk, revealed the fundamental delusion that would help destroy the Third Reich. Everything about the behavior of American society reveals that it is half-Judaized and the other half-Negrified, Hitler declared with absolute certainty. How can one expect a state like that to hold together? This was not casual dinner conversation. This was the core belief that shaped Nazi Germany's strategic assessment of its most powerful enemy. Hitler genuinely believed that racial diversity made nations weak, that Jewish influence corrupted industrial capacity, that democracy rendered societies militarily impotent. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, orchestrated a systematic campaign through his weekly newspaper, Das Reich, to reinforce these beliefs. On August 9, 1942, Goebbels ridiculed America as God's country, where, if left to its own resources, the land would soon return once more to desert and prairie, as wide and as empty as the souls of its people. Hermann Göring, as Reich Marshal and head of the Luftwaffe, epitomized this dismissive attitude with his famous claim that Americans could only make refrigerators and razor blades. They would never produce the military equipment necessary to defeat Germany, he insisted. German military planners studied American performance in World War I and drew dismissive conclusions. The United States Army of 1918 numbered fewer than 200,000 men before the draft. Surely, Nazi strategists reasoned, this was not a nation built for modern mechanized warfare. The initial evidence seemed to confirm German prejudices. At the Battle of Kasserine Pass in February 1943, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps inflicted a devastating defeat on American forces. 6,300 American casualties, including 300 killed. German forces suffered only 989 casualties. American material losses were staggering. 183 tanks lost, 104 half-tracks, 208 artillery pieces. Nazi newspapers proclaimed that American troops broke and ran when faced with professional German soldiers. But experienced German officers noticed something troubling. Rommel himself wrote that the tactical conduct of the enemy's defense had been first class. They had recovered very quickly after the first shock. Later, Rommel acknowledged even more. Even at that time, the American generals showed themselves to be very advanced in the tactical handling of their forces. The Desert Fox had recognized something that Hitler and Goebbels refused to see. The Americans learned quickly. They adapted their tactics, and most alarming of all, their equipment was arriving in staggering quantities. By May 1943, Just 3 months after Kasserine Pass, American forces had driven Axis armies completely from North Africa. General Jürgen von Arnim surrendered along with approximately 250,000 German and Italian soldiers in Tunisia. The lesson of Kasserine Pass was not American incompetence. It was American adaptability. While Nazi propaganda continued to mock American industrial capacity, the reality unfolding across the Atlantic was staggering beyond comprehension. The numbers were so extreme that German intelligence officers who reported them were sometimes accused of exaggeration or defeatism. But the numbers were real, verified, and growing every month. In 1943 alone, America produced 29,497 tanks. To provide perspective, Germany produced 26,925 tanks during the entire war from 1939 to 1945. America built more tanks in 1 year than Germany managed in 6 years of total war. The M4 Sherman tank became a symbol of the gap between German perceptions and American reality. German tankers initially dismissed the Sherman as inferior to their Tigers. German crews nicknamed it the Ronson because it supposedly lit up on the first strike. But when German forces captured a Sherman in Tunisia, they shipped it to Kummersdorf Weapon Testing Center for evaluation. The German technical assessment contradicted the propaganda. The Sherman was well built, reliable, and comfortable. German engineers described it as an automotive masterpiece the Germans could only dream of producing. What German tankers failed to appreciate was the strategic implication of American mass production. For every Tiger tank Germany produced, America was producing dozens of Shermans. A Tiger might destroy 3 or 4 Shermans before being knocked out, but if America could field 20 Shermans for every Tiger, the mathematics of attrition favored the Allies overwhelmingly. Aircraft production told an even more dramatic story. In 1943 alone, America produced 84,853 aircraft. By 1944, production peaked at 96,270 aircraft. This was more than Japan produced during the entire war. American aircraft factories operated 3 shifts, 24 hours daily, 7 days weekly. Women who had never worked in factories before learned to rivet aluminum, install hydraulic systems, and assemble complex instruments. By 1943, women comprised 65% of the aircraft industry workforce, up from 1% before the war. The Ford Motor Company built a massive plant at Willow Run, Michigan, specifically designed to manufacture B-24 Liberator bombers. The factory sprawled across 3.5 million square feet. At peak production, Willow Run employed 42,000 workers, including over 15,000 women. At maximum production in 1944, Willow Run produced 1 complete B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. Peak monthly production reached 428 bombers in April 1944. The Liberty ship program exemplified American industrial innovation applied to naval construction. Through systematic improvement of mass production techniques pioneered by industrialist Henry Kaiser, average construction time dropped to 30 to 42 days by 1943. The record holder, SS Robert E. Peary, launched in exactly 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. By 1943, America launched 3 Liberty ships every single day. Total Liberty ship production reached 2,710 vessels. German U-boats sank Allied merchant ships by the hundreds, but American shipyards replaced losses faster than submarines could sink them. Admiral Karl Dönitz watched his strategy of starving Britain into submission collapse under the weight of American shipbuilding. By 1944, the United States produced 2/3 of all Allied military equipment, 297,000 aircraft, 193,000 artillery pieces, 86,000 tanks, 2 million army trucks. American artillery particularly impressed German commanders. Rommel wrote to his wife during Kasserine Pass, noting the effectiveness of American artillery. An observation plane directed the fire of numerous batteries on all worthwhile targets throughout the zone. German generals consistently noted that American artillery was more mobile, larger caliber, longer ranged, and better supplied than German equivalents. Once proximity fuses were deployed, American artillery became utterly devastating. Nazi ideology had insisted that American industrial capacity was exaggerated propaganda, that American workers were too soft and undisciplined to match German production, that Jewish influence and racial mixing had corrupted American society beyond military effectiveness. Every single one of these assumptions was catastrophically wrong. American democracy proved more resilient and adaptable than German dictatorship. American mass production techniques translated brilliantly to weapons manufacture, and most devastatingly for Nazi racial theory. American diversity became a source of strength that Germany could not match. The proof lay in the diversity of Americans who built and wielded the arsenal of democracy. The very people Hitler dismissed as racial inferiors demonstrated capabilities that shattered Nazi racial theories completely. African American soldiers proved their courage and competence on battlefields across Europe. The Tuskegee Airmen shattered every racist assumption. Of 992 pilots trained, 450 deployed overseas, flying 1,578 combat missions. The Tuskegee Airmen destroyed 112 enemy aircraft in air combat, 150 on the ground. Most remarkably, they lost only 27 bombers on escort missions, compared to an average of 46 for other P-51 groups. This was the lowest loss rate of any escort fighter group. Bomber crews specifically requested the Tuskegee Airmen as escorts because they knew these black pilots would protect them. These were the men that Hitler's racial ideology insisted were incapable of mastering complex machinery or showing martial courage. Reality proved Hitler catastrophically wrong. The 761st Tank Battalion, known as the Black Panthers, attached to General George Patton's Third Army in October 1944. They fought 183 consecutive days in combat. They breached the Siegfried Line, liberated over 30 towns, and were among the first American units to meet Soviet forces in Austria. The battalion suffered approaching 50% casualties. Patton came to respect the Black Panthers' fighting ability and relied on them in critical operations. The Red Ball Express represented one of the most critical contributions to Allied victory. This truck convoy system, 75% African American drivers, totaling approximately 23,000 personnel, transported 412,000 tons of supplies over 82 days. At peak operation, 6,000 trucks transported 12,500 tons daily. General Patton called the 2.5-ton truck our most valuable weapon, acknowledging that his rapid advance across France depended entirely on this supply lifeline. Without the predominantly black drivers of the Red Ball Express, Patton's tanks would have run out of fuel within days. Jewish scientists fleeing Nazi persecution built the atomic bomb. The Manhattan Project's roster reads like a catalogue of refugees from Hitler's racial policies. J. Robert Oppenheimer directed the project. Leo Szilard, Albert Einstein, Edward Teller, Hans Bethe, Niels Bohr, John von Neumann, and Richard Feynman were among dozens of Jewish scientists whose brilliance Hitler had forced into exile. These men, whom Nazi ideology classified as subhuman parasites, developed the weapon that would make American victory absolute. Nazi Germany expelled the scientists who might have given them atomic weapons first. Those same scientists, welcomed by America's pluralistic society, built the bomb that ensured Hitler's regime would be utterly destroyed. Native American code talkers provided unbreakable battlefield communications. Approximately 400 to 420 Navajo Marines developed a code based on their native language. Japanese cryptographers never broke the Navajo code despite intensive efforts. They could not even identify what language was being spoken. At Iwo Jima, 6 Navajo code talkers sent and received over 800 messages in the first 2 days, all without error. Major Howard Connor stated bluntly that, were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima. Japanese-American soldiers proved their loyalty despite suffering the injustice of internment camps. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team became the most decorated unit for its size and length of service in United States military history. 21 Medals of Honor, 29 Distinguished Service Crosses, 560 Silver Stars, 9,486 Purple Hearts. The 442nd suffered a 314% casualty rate. The rescue of the lost battalion exemplifies their sacrifice. Over 5 days in October 1944, the 442nd suffered over 800 casualties, more than 140 killed, and over 600 wounded, to rescue 211 trapped men. These Japanese-American soldiers fought with extraordinary courage while their families were imprisoned. They fought not because they were treated fairly, but because they loved their country and wanted to prove their loyalty. Women transformed American war production from an impossibility to reality. The female workforce increased from 27% in 1940 to 37% in 1945. Approximately 6 million women entered the workforce during the war years. In aircraft manufacturing, women comprised 65% of the workforce by 1943. At Willow Run's B-24 bomber plant, over 15,000 female workers built the bombers that would pound German positions in Normandy. Without women workers, American industrial production could never have reached the levels that overwhelmed German capacity. American production did not only equip American forces. Through Lend-Lease, America became the arsenal of democracy for all Allied nations. Britain received over $31 billion in aid. The Soviet Union received over $11 billion, including 49,000 trucks, 12,000 armored vehicles, and 11,000 aircraft. Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov acknowledged that, without American trucks, we wouldn't have had anything to pull our artillery with. American industrial production supported not just American forces, but the entire Allied war effort. German intelligence officers knew these numbers. They read reports of American production, statistics. But Nazi ideology provided a framework that reinterpreted the evidence. The numbers must be exaggerated, they reasoned. American production was supposedly inferior quality. Every assumption proved wrong. American production numbers were accurate. American equipment quality was generally excellent. Allied unity held together, and the supposedly impossible feat of supplying multiple Allied nations while fielding massive American forces was accomplished through systematic industrial organization. Before D-Day, German defenders had experienced American industrial might through strategic bombing. From 1943 onward, American B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators pounded German cities in daylight raids. The 8th Air Force grew to over 200,000 personnel and thousands of heavy bombers by 1944. On single raids, the 8th Air Force could dispatch over 1,000 heavy bombers, escorted by hundreds of P-51 Mustang fighters. A 1,000 bomber raid delivered 8 million pounds of high explosives in a single mission. By spring 1944, German soldiers in Normandy could look up and see American bombers passing overhead, hundreds of aircraft in tight formations, heading east to drop tons of explosives on German cities. The Luftwaffe had been ground down by attrition. Experienced pilots were killed faster than replacements could be trained. By D-Day, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former strength, unable to contest Allied air superiority over France. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By spring 1944, the question was not whether the Allies would invade France, but when and where. Rommel and von Rundstedt disagreed on defensive strategy, but agreed that stopping the invasion at the beaches was essential. Rommel wanted panzer divisions positioned close to the coast. Von Rundstedt preferred holding armour in reserve. But Rommel recognized what von Rundstedt initially underestimated. Allied air superiority would make large-scale armoured movement suicidal. In his pre-invasion assessment, Rommel wrote prophetically, "Anyone who has to fight, even with the most modern weapons, against an enemy in complete command of the air, fights like a savage against modern European troops, under the same handicaps and with the same chances of success. On June 5, 1944, weather forecasts predicted 2 weeks unsuitable for invasion. Rommel left France to celebrate his wife's birthday. Many German officers relaxed their vigilance. German intelligence intercepted Allied code messages. Lieutenant Colonel Meyer alerted 15th Army and telephoned headquarters. The chain of command failed catastrophically. Each level assumed someone else was handling it. The only German forces fully alerted failed to act because of confusion in command. But Allied meteorologists identified a brief window of acceptable weather on June 6. General Dwight Eisenhower made the decision to go. In the darkness before dawn on June 6, over 23,000 Allied airborne troops dropped into Normandy. American paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne jumped behind Utah Beach. British and Canadian paratroopers secured the eastern flank. Despite chaos, small groups of paratroopers accomplished critical objectives, seizing bridges and blocking roads. At 05:45, naval bombardment began. 84 warships plus dozens of landing craft opened fire on German coastal defences. The sound was overwhelming, a continuous thunder of explosions. USS Nevada fired 337 rounds of 14-inch shells at Utah Beach alone. HMS Belfast would fire over 400 6-inch shells. German defenders experienced bombardment unlike anything they had encountered. Concrete bunkers shook and cracked. Communications lines were severed. At 06:30, the first assault waves hit the beaches. 132,715 seaborne troops would land on 5 beaches that day. Utah Beach proved the least costly. Strong currents pushed landing craft south of the planned site, accidentally avoiding the heaviest defenses. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr. led the 4th Infantry Division ashore. When he realized they had landed in the wrong location, he declared, "We'll start the war from right here." Utah Beach casualties were remarkably light, fewer than 200. Omaha Beach became the bloodiest landing. German defenses were more extensive than predicted. The 352nd Infantry Division was a higher quality unit than most coastal divisions. The first assault waves suffered devastating casualties. German machine gun fire swept the beach. For several hours, it appeared the assault might fail. But small groups of soldiers began advancing up the bluffs. Engineers cleared obstacles. Naval destroyers moved dangerously close to shore to provide fire support. By day's end, approximately 2,400 American casualties had been suffered, but the beach was secured. The British and Canadian landings faced varying resistance but established solid beachheads. Overhead, Allied air superiority was absolute. 11,590 Allied aircraft were available on D-Day. These aircraft flew 14,674 sorties. The Luftwaffe could field only 319 to 815 serviceable aircraft in all of Western France. The ratio was approximately 37 Allied sorties for every 1 German sortie. Luftwaffe fighter ace Josef Priller made a single strafing run across Sword Beach, with his wingman in the only German air attack on the beaches that day. 2 aircraft against 11,590. The total invasion force comprised 6,939 vessels. This included 1,213 naval combat ships, 4,126 landing ships and landing craft, 736 ancillary craft, and 864 merchant vessels. Naval personnel totaled 195,700 sailors. By the end of D-Day, approximately 156,000 Allied troops had landed in Normandy, 73,000 Americans, 83,000 British and Canadian. German defenders had been overwhelmed by the scale and coordination of an operation that Nazi ideology had insisted was beyond Allied capability. Germany had nominally 58 divisions in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Approximately 850,000 troops spread over 2,000 miles of coastline, but quality varied dramatically. Many were static divisions lacking transport. About half included Osttruppen poor-quality units formed from former Soviet prisoners of war pressed into German service. These were not the elite panzer and infantry divisions that had conquered France in 1940. LXXIV Corps, commanded by General Erich Marx, directly faced all 5 invasion beaches with only 3 divisions, 2 of them static. When the invasion began, Marx understood immediately what was at stake. When ordering Colonel Hermann von Opperlein-Bronikowski to lead 21st Panzer Division's counterattack, Marx stated bluntly, "If you don't succeed in throwing the British into the sea, we shall have lost the war." The 21st Panzer Division represented the only German armoured counterattack on D-Day itself. The division reached the Channel coast around 2000 hours, splitting Juno and Sword beaches. For a brief moment, German tanks had reached their objective, but the division lacked infantry support and reinforcements to exploit its success. Massive Allied naval gunfire targeted any German movement. The sudden appearance of 250 Allied gliders overhead forced withdrawal by 2100 hours. Hitler slept late on June 6th. Panzer reserves were not released until 1500 hours, a critical 12-hour delay that allowed Allied forces to consolidate their beachheads. The divided command structure paralyzed German response during the crucial first hours, when rapid counterattack might have made a difference. When Chief of Staff General Hans Speidel telephoned Rommel with news of major Allied landings, Rommel repeatedly muttered while rushing back to Normandy, "How stupid of me! How stupid of me!" He arrived at headquarters around 2200 hours. By then, 156,000 Allied troops had landed and established beachheads. It was already too late. What shocked German commanders even more than the initial landings was what came next. The invasion did not slow down, it accelerated. By the end of June, 850,000 Allied troops, 570,000 tons of supplies, and 150,000 vehicles had crossed the Channel. The mathematics were merciless and undeniable. The Germans were being buried under an avalanche of men and material that never stopped flowing. The secret to sustaining this unprecedented invasion lay in American logistical innovation, on a scale German military planners had never imagined possible. Within days of the initial landings, American engineers accomplished what German intelligence had deemed impossible. They built artificial harbours in the middle of the English Channel. The Mulberry harbours represented engineering ambition that defied conventional military thinking. Months before D-Day, American and British engineers had designed giant artificial ports assembled from massive concrete caissons called Phoenix units, floating roadways known as whales, and breakwaters created from sunken block ships. On June 9th, just 3 days after the landings, Mulberry A at Omaha Beach was already receiving supplies. Mulberry B at Arromanches became fully operational, handling 7,000 tons per day, the equivalent of a major European port. German intelligence had never considered such a possibility. To them, ports were fixed structures that took years to build. The idea that the Americans could simply bring their own port across the Channel stunned them. Each Mulberry harbour required 600,000 tons of concrete, 31 miles of floating roadway, and more steel than the Eiffel Tower. Entire British and American factories had been diverted to the project for months. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, Hitler's intelligence chief, later admitted that not a single accurate report about Mulberry construction had reached Berlin before D-Day. When German officers toured the wreckage of Mulberry A after a storm partially destroyed it on June 19th, they shook their heads in disbelief. "Even our engineers could not have dreamed this," one remarked. But what truly shocked them was that even after the storm, damaged one harbour, American supply rates barely decreased. Engineers simply shifted operations, unloaded supplies directly across beaches using landing craft, amphibious trucks called DUKWs, and floating causeways. Within days, they were moving 6,000 tons per day across open beaches. For German commanders accustomed to having operations paralysed by far less severe setbacks, this adaptability was incomprehensible. Behind the beaches, American engineers built supply systems that dwarfed anything the Germans had attempted. The Red Ball Express, launched in August 1944, became a rolling artery of fuel, ammunition, and rations. At its peak, 6,000 trucks roared day and night from Normandy depots to front lines. Each truck carried 2.5 tons of supplies. Convoys often stretched 60 miles. In just 3 months, the Red Ball delivered 412,000 tons of material. German generals, who still relied on horse-drawn wagons for 80% of their logistics, were stunned to learn the Americans had built a highway system of moving trucks that never stopped. The mathematics were brutal and inescapable. A single U.S. infantry division required 700 tons of supplies per day. By late June, the Allies had landed 10 divisions. By August, more than 40. That meant 28,000 tons of supplies daily, equivalent to the weight of the entire German 7th Army. Yet somehow, the Americans kept it flowing. Food, bullets, fuel, even ice cream. German soldiers, half-starved and low on ammunition, watched with bitterness as captured American prisoners boasted of eating fresh meat and drinking Coca-Cola in the field. Fuel represented the ultimate testament to American logistical capability. In mechanized war, fuel meant movement, and movement meant victory. German tanks often sat idle for lack of gasoline. American engineers solved the problem with Pluto pipeline under the ocean. Beginning in August 1944, they laid flexible pipelines under the English Channel, pumping millions of gallons of fuel directly to depots in France. By war's end, Pluto had delivered over 172 million gallons. German commanders who relied on vulnerable rail lines, constantly bombed by Allied aircraft, could not comprehend such abundance. "They fight with rivers of fuel," one officer lamented, "while we fight with drops." American supply dumps in Normandy were so vast that reconnaissance pilots mistook them for cities. The Saint-Lô depot, nicknamed the City of Canvas, covered 25 square miles with tents, barrels, crates, and fuel drums stacked higher than houses. German intelligence officers, when shown aerial photos after the war, refused at first to believe they were supply depots. On the ground, the psychological impact was devastating. German soldiers who captured American rations were amazed to find not only canned meat and coffee, but also chocolate, cigarettes, and chewing gum. A single USK ration contained more calories than some German soldiers received in 2 days. Prisoners later testified that their first doubt about victory came not from defeat in battle, but from tasting American food. "If they can feed every man like this," one POW said, "then we cannot win." The contrast became stark during specific battles. At Caen, German defenders rationed their artillery shells, sometimes firing only 2 rounds per day. American batteries fired thousands. At one point, a single US division expended more shells in 24 hours than the entire German 7th Army had available for a week. By the end of June, the Allies had landed 850,000 men and 148,000 vehicles. By July, they averaged 1 new division landed every 5 days. German commanders, still waiting for reinforcements delayed by Allied air attacks on French railways, were horrified. They could not replace losses, while the Americans seemed to conjure fresh armies from the sea. The sustainment was as shocking as the initial landing itself. Field Marshal von Rundstedt filed his formal 3,100-word assessment on June 20th, just 2 weeks after D-Day. His report identified the primary factor in Allied success with brutal honesty: the enemy's complete mastery in the air. Von Rundstedt noted that 29,000 Allied sorties were counted in 2.5 days, reaching as deep as 65 miles from the beachhead. Of these, about 2,300 aircraft a day, dive bomb and strafe every movement on the ground, even a single soldier, he wrote. Allied naval guns had made the movement of tanks by day in open country impossible. The enemy carries the battle right into the home battlefront with his tactical bombers, von Rundstedt reported, to interrupt supplies and replacements and cause so many casualties in rolling stock and motorized columns that supply and replacements have become a very serious problem. By June 29th, von Rundstedt's frustration boiled over. When Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel asked, "What shall we do?" von Rundstedt replied with shocking bluntness, "Make peace, you idiots. What else can you do?" He was dismissed on July 4th, officially due to age and ill health. In reality, he had recognized what Hitler refused to accept. The war in the West was lost. Germany no longer possessed the military capacity to defeat the forces arrayed against it. General Erich Marx was killed on June 12th by Allied air attack. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel attempted to convince Hitler that the war in the West was lost and that Germany should seek peace before total destruction. On July 15th, 1944, Rommel sent Hitler a personal letter stating that the situation on the Normandy front is growing worse every day and is rapidly approaching a crisis. The unequal struggle is approaching its end. 2 days later, on July 17th, Rommel's staff car was strafed by an Allied fighter. The attack left Rommel with severe head injuries that ended his active military service. On October 14th, 1944, implicated in the July 20th plot to assassinate Hitler, Rommel was forced to commit suicide. The transformation from Hitler's January 1942 dismissal of America as half-Judaized and half-Negrified to von Rundstedt's June 1944 assessment of complete enemy mastery represented more than military defeat. It demonstrated how ideology, when divorced from empirical reality, produces catastrophic strategic miscalculation. Nazi leaders genuinely believed their racial theories. They convinced themselves that racial diversity weakened nations, that Jewish influence corrupted societies, that democracy made countries militarily impotent. These were not cynical propaganda lies. They were core beliefs that shaped German strategic assessment. The evidence of American industrial capacity was available throughout 1942 and 1943. Germany possessed excellent intelligence services. They knew American production numbers, but Nazi ideology provided a framework that reinterpreted evidence. American production was dismissed as inferior quality. American soldiers were dismissed as poorly motivated. American society was dismissed as fundamentally divided and weak. Ideology functioned as a filter that made contradictory evidence invisible or unimportant. By June 6, 1944, reality could no longer be denied or reinterpreted. Not when 156,000 troops landed from 6,939 ships under cover of 11,590 aircraft. Not when Allied naval guns made German tank movement suicidal. Not when Allied air superiority achieved ratios of 37-1. The gap between Nazi ideology and empirical reality had become unbridgeable. Rommel's pre-invasion prediction proved prophetically accurate. Allied air superiority exposed panzers to devastating fighter-bomber attacks, preventing their movement exactly as he had warned. The strategic debate between different defensive strategies became irrelevant when Allied air and naval power made large-scale German counterattacks impossible regardless of positioning. The final bitter irony completed the circle of German self-destruction. Nazi racial policies directly strengthened America while weakening Germany. Jewish scientists fleeing persecution built the Manhattan Project. African-American soldiers proved their courage on European battlefields. Japanese-American soldiers became the most decorated unit in American military history, while their families were imprisoned. Women built the aircraft and ships that achieved Allied superiority. Every principle of Nazi racial ideology translated into strategic disadvantage. Hitler's dismissal of America flowed logically from Nazi racial theory. That same theory predicted American collapse, industrial inadequacy, military incompetence, and societal fragmentation. American reality systematically falsified every prediction. The half-Judaized and half-Negrified nation that Hitler dismissed in January 1942 had become, by June 1944, the industrial and military power that German commanders recognized could no longer be defeated. The beaches of Normandy became the graveyard of Nazi illusions. There, on the sand and in the surf, German defenders confronted the reality they had denied for so long. America was not weak. Its society was not fractured beyond recovery. Its industrial power was not propaganda, but frightening reality. And perhaps most important, the soldiers who came ashore that day, soldiers from every American state, and dozens of ethnic backgrounds fought with courage and determination that equaled anything German soldiers could muster. When Oberst Fritz Zeigler tried to count the ships stretching across the English Channel on the morning of June 6th, he gave up after 100 vessels because he realized he was counting only one small sector of a fleet that extended beyond the limits of vision. The actual number 6,939 vessels represented something more profound than simple arithmetic. It represented the complete refutation of Nazi ideology. It represented the power of a diverse, democratic society to mobilize resources on a scale that authoritarian regimes could not match. It represented the consequences of strategic planning based on prejudice rather than reality. The German soldiers defending Normandy learned in the most terrible way that propaganda is a poor substitute for truth. The America they had been taught to despise and dismiss was in fact a colossus. The racial diversity they had been told made America weak had made it strong. The democracy they had been assured was chaotic and inefficient had proven itself capable of extraordinary organization and focus. The industrial capacity they had been promised was exaggerated, was, if anything, understated in intelligence reports that had seemed too extreme to believe. D-Day was not the end of the war. 11 months of brutal fighting remained before German surrender on May 8, 1945. German soldiers continued to fight with skill and courage, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The industrial and military might arrayed against Germany was simply too great. The Atlantic Wall had been breached, the fortress of Europe had been entered, and the armies that came ashore in Normandy would not stop until they met Soviet forces in the heart of Berlin. Adolf Hitler's contemptuous dismissal of America stands as one of history's great miscalculations. Those words, spoken with such certainty in January 1942, revealed the fatal flaw at the heart of Nazi ideology. The racial theories that animated the Third Reich prevented German leadership from understanding that strength comes from multiple sources: industrial capacity, technological innovation, social cohesion, moral purpose, and diversity of talent and perspective. America possessed all these strengths. Nazi Germany, blinded by ideology, could not see them until it was too late. For 3 years, from December 1941, when Hitler declared war on America, to June 1944, when Allied forces landed in Normandy, Nazi leadership clung to the belief that America's supposed weaknesses would prevent it from playing a decisive role in Europe. Those 3 years allowed America to build the largest military force in its history, supported by the greatest industrial mobilization the world had ever seen. When that force finally arrived on the beaches of Normandy, it arrived with a power that German propaganda had insisted was impossible. The shock that German defenders experienced when they saw the Allied Armada approaching Normandy was the shock of reality colliding with ideology. They had believed propaganda about American weakness. They had accepted the comfortable lie that their racial superiority would guarantee victory. The thousands of ships and aircraft that filled sea and sky that June morning represented truth they could no longer deny. Von Rundstedt's advice to "make peace, you idiots," acknowledged the conclusion that evidence had been screaming since American production began ramping up in 1942. Nazi ideology had led Germany into a war it could not win against an enemy it had fundamentally misunderstood. The supposedly weak and divided nation had mobilized power on a scale that dwarfed anything the Third Reich could match. The lesson extends beyond World War II. Ideology divorced from reality, beliefs maintained despite contradictory evidence. Strategic planning based on wishful thinking rather than honest assessment. These produce catastrophic failure, regardless of how sincerely held the beliefs may be. Nazi racial theory was not just morally abhorrent. It was strategically suicidal. It led German leadership to systematically underestimate their enemies and overestimate their own capabilities. The Americans, British, and Canadians who landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, were not supermen. They were ordinary people from democratic societies who had mobilized their industrial capacity, organized their military forces, and found the courage to cross the Channel into the teeth of German defenses. They came from every background, every ethnicity, every region. They proved through victory what Nazi ideology had denied. Diversity is strength. Democracy can fight and win total war. Free societies possess advantages that dictatorships can never match. The German officers who stared in disbelief at the Allied Armada on June 6, 1944, were witnessing the consequences of their leadership's delusions. They had been told for 3 years that America was weak, divided, and incapable of sustained military effort. They had been promised that German superiority would prevail. Instead, they faced an enemy who brought to battle a level of material power that made German resistance ultimately futile. 3 years after Hitler's contemptuous dismissal of America, his own commanders were advising him to make peace because the war was lost. The scale of American industrial and military power that materialized in Normandy had proved every Nazi assumption catastrophically wrong. Ideology had met reality, and reality had won decisively. The story of Nazi Germany's fatal underestimation of America stands as an enduring warning. Believe your own propaganda at your peril. Ignore evidence that contradicts your worldview at catastrophic cost. Underestimate your enemies based on prejudice rather than realistic assessment. And you may find yourself staring in shock at a horizon filled with ships that prove everything you believed was wrong. The officers, looking across the English Channel on that June morning in 1944, learned that lesson in the harshest way possible, as their world and their ideology crumbled before the overwhelming reality of American power. When Captain Helmut Lang witnessed the fleet that morning and whispered to Rommel, "This is not an invasion. It is a continent moving across the water," he spoke a truth more profound than he realized. It was indeed a continent moving the industrial might of an entire nation, mobilized by a diverse democracy that Nazi ideology had insisted could never exist. The 6,939 vessels were not just ships. They were the physical manifestation of everything Hitler had gotten wrong. Every rivet, every engine, every ton of supplies represented the labor of Americans that Nazi racial theory claimed were incapable of such achievement. Jewish scientists who built the radar systems guiding Allied aircraft, African-American drivers who hauled supplies across France, Japanese-American soldiers who fought with unmatched courage, women who had welded the hulls and assembled the engines, Native Americans who provided unbreakable communications. The fleet that stretched beyond counting across the English Channel was built by the very people Hitler had dismissed, and it had come to destroy the ideology that claimed they were inferior. The morning of June 6, 1944 did not just mark the beginning of the liberation of Europe. It marked the moment when Nazi racial theory collided with American reality and shattered completely. The Wehrmacht generals, who could not count all 6,939 vessels, were not simply witnessing a military invasion. They were watching the death of an ideology that had insisted such a thing was impossible. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.